I'm very happy to continue discussing with Lee Dugatkin, evolutionary biologist, with whom we already met last time for our podcast. And we were really happy to discuss with him several aspects about evolutionary biology, a little bit about his books, which we would like to come back later, of course. But now I would like to ask something which is more related to lecturing and teaching, right? It's something which is a subject which is particularly interesting for lecturers without borders, but not only. It's interesting for teachers in the aspect of how one can actually lecture about evolutionary biology. What are your suggestions, or what are your tips on that, like your experience?
Yeah, so I would say, in general, when I'm lecturing about evolutionary biology, whatever the topic is. So for example, I give a lot of lectures on cooperation and altruism and aggression and domestication and cultural evolution. And one way I like to try and start is to just talk to the audience a little bit about an example that they might already be familiar with in the context of what I'm talking about. So for example, if I'm talking about the evolution of altruism and cooperation, I'll sort of give a definition, but then I'll give them some example. So for example, imagine you've just read another story in the newspaper about somebody who has jumped onto the tube tracks or the subway tracks to save another person who's fallen in there. The train's coming. It's a very dangerous situation. You don't know who the person is. And somebody goes in and they jump onto the tracks and try and save them. And so this is, for example, what we mean by altruism, something that's costly to an individual but helps others. And everybody immediately knows what I'm talking about there. And so they're now in the right mindset. They're now thinking about what I want to be talking to them about. Now, they're thinking about it at a very general level, something they might have read in the newspaper, and then I will take them from there to saying, okay, now this is also something that evolutionary biologists have thought a lot about. In fact, we've been thinking about it for 150 years. And here's how the early thoughts on this went from Darwin and on. And here's where we are now. And so I will often do it that way. And I'll say, so here's some of the ideas, and here are some of the experiments on this topic.
And actually, talking about the evolution, right, of altruism, me as a person who is more from the mathematical side, right, of this, all this field, I don't really know the example of the kind of applied examples of the altruism, evolution of the altruism. Could you give some example of what could be the result, for example, of that?
Oh, sure. Do you mean you want me to actually discuss a little bit some of the mathematical models, or do you mean you'd like to hear a couple of interesting studies that have been done in evolution?
Yeah, maybe studies, because I know that a lot of people actually don't know so much about evolution of altruism.
No, sure. I'm happy to do that. And there are, I'll give you one or two. I should say, though, just so people understand, there are hundreds, arguably thousands of published studies on this sort of thing. So you're just going to hear a little bit, but I'll pick one that's fairly famous, and then I'll also talk about some work that we have done in my own lab on this. So one of the more famous examples deals with, of all creatures, vampire bats. So, we know about these vampire bats from everything from folk legends to everyday encounters, and vampire bats are sort of famous because they drink blood. That's one of the main things they get their nutrients from. Okay. Yeah. So the thing about it is that bats in general, most mammals don't fly, right? Bats do. It's really, really expensive energetically to fly. And people who have studied vampire bats know that if a vampire bat doesn't get a new blood meal, about every 2 days, it can starve to death. So this is a really important thing for them to get. And, you know, most of the blood meals are not from humans. That almost, I don't know that any are. It's mostly from cattle and other things in the field. All right, so if you're a vampire bat, it's really important that you get a good blood meal fairly often. But a lot of times, vampire bats can't find that. And so what do? Well, a fellow by the name of Jerry Wilkinson did a famous study back in the 1980s, and he's continued with the work up till now. And he was studying vampire bats in Trinidad. And, you know, they live inside trees. And Wilkinson was able to sort of get in there with cameras and look up and see what the vampire bats were doing. And one of the odd things that he saw was this. Sometimes one of the vampire bats it looked to him like be soliciting another vampire bat in the roost for food. So some of the vampire bats have a really big belly, like they look like they just had a blood meal, and others are very, very thin, and it's clear they haven't. Often what he would see is a bat that looked like it was starving, go up to another bat that had a blood meal in its stomach and begin grooming it and do certain kinds of behavior. And sometimes what they would get would be a blood meal. So what would happen sometimes is the bat that had lots of blood in its stomach would regurgitate some of that blood. It would give it to the other starving bat.
Wow.
This is a classic example of what we mean by altruism. It's really costly for you to do this, right? And it really helps others. So the question then from an evolutionary perspective is, how on earth does this kind of thing evolve? Why should animals ever do anything that helps others but hurts themselves? Well, it turns out in this case, what's going on is something called reciprocal altruism. That is the exchange of altruistic acts. What Wilkinson figured out from his work was this, that most of the time when a starving bat tries to do this, they get nothing. They don't get any blood meal from somebody else, but sometimes they do. So what is it that makes those sometimes different? Well, it turns out that the vampire bats are keeping track of who helps them when they're starving. And so if you're starving and you're trying to get a meal from another bat, the probability of you getting that meal from a bat who has blood in its gut is really heavily related to whether or not when that bat was starving and they went to you when you had food, you gave it to them. So they're keeping track of who helps them, and then they're being nice to those who help them, but not so nice to those who did not.
Wow.
This is a classic example of altruism. And that might be enough for you. I don't necessarily.
Yeah, but it's beautiful because actually, if I would listen to this example, I think much more before I became, like, for example, mathematician, right? I would actually think about how, I don't know, to model that, or like it's an inspiring thing because it comes from the nature, which is beautiful. So I love it. And actually, it comes also to the next question, which I wanted to ask, which was about some examples which you wanted like to give, right, to the students when you were teaching or when you were lecturing to the public, which would be contextualized based on the country. Because I heard that you are traveling, right, a lot, and you have been lecturing in different countries. And for us, it's very important to know some specific, right, maybe place specific, right, examples, if you ever had any examples of such.
It's a good question, and I think the answer for that is really going to vary very much based on the person you're talking to. In my case, I basically give sort of two kinds of lectures when I'm traveling around the world. One of them is the kind of lecture that I just mentioned, one where I'm talking about, for example, the evolution of altruism or the evolution of domestication or culture. Now, in those cases, most of the time, the vast majority of my talk will be similar regardless of where I'm giving it. You know, the exception would be that if something, if there was, for example, a really famous case of altruism in the folklore or in the news in the country I'm speaking of, then instead of talking about somebody jumping on the subway tracks, I might start with that. Or if I'm talking about the evolution of aggression, I might see if I can find something that's an example that people in my audience will immediately know.
Yeah.
But most of the time for the evolution talks, it doesn't really matter where I am. The material is going to be the same because it really is. It's really a universal topic. Now, the other kinds of lectures I give, you know, they're a little bit more history of science. And when I talk about history of science, sometimes I'm talking about an example that's based on something that took place in the United States. And so in those cases, so I have a book, for example, one of our more famous presidents, Thomas Jefferson, back in the early 1800s, was also a great natural historian and scientist. And I have a book all about Jefferson and natural history. So if I'm talking in the United States, I really don't have to spend a lot of time starting by saying who Thomas Jefferson is and why it's important to think about him. But if I'm talking about this in Croatia or Mongolia, then I might spend a couple of minutes explaining, okay, so this is who this person is. Now let me tell you an incredible story about science and this person. You know, if I'm talking in France, I would probably give an introduction, but not necessarily as long as the one in Mongolia, because, you know, people in France will have heard of Jefferson. So I'll give a little bit. And so it really depends. You know, when I talk about the book that I did on the domestication of foxes, and that experiment happened and is still going on in Siberia. So there I will give a little bit of context about what the Soviet Union was like when the experiment began, how that's changed over the years. And you know how much context I give and how much of a little bit of history I do at the beginning before I get into the science. It'll depend exactly on where I am. You know, countries that have a little bit more of a history with the Soviet Union, I don't have to go into, and now Russia, I don't have to go into that as much. Other places I go into it more. So I think as a lecturer, I think the main thing is to sort of always be thinking about who's in the audience and where do you have to get them before you can start talking about the heart of what you're going to be talking about.
Yeah, true. And actually coming back to your books and also to some of the materials which we were discussing before on the history of science, right? Because before, like even right in the book, which is about taming the fox, you still bring this context. For example, but do you think, for example, when you describe the one of the most known evolutionary biologist, Darwin, do you need to bring this context also?
You know, I think it's like everything with someone who tries hard to reach their audience. It really depends. I mean, yes, always to some extent, but more in some places than others. So what I mean by that is that, you know, obviously if I'm giving a talk at a university, I don't really need to do that. If I'm giving a talk at, let's say, a science society of people who, you know, just the general public who's interested in science, there, I can assume that people have heard about who Darwin is, but I will discuss it. I will talk about him. I will say, you know, here's who this person is. Here's how his ideas on natural selection and evolution changed the way that the world thought about its own history. And then, you know, if it's perhaps an audience that isn't even a science audience, even a general public science audience, but maybe it's at a history society or something, then I'll do a little bit more. I'll sort of say, you know, here's a little bit about Darwin and how he developed as a scientist. And then how did he come to these ideas, whichever ideas I happen to be talking about. So yes, I mean, I think you need to do that. You need to explain to people who this person was and why what they did was important. And in Darwin's case, it was so fundamental. It was something that I argue, not just to my students, but to the general public, that, you know, once you understand Darwin's ideas on evolutionary biology, from then and then, you know, up to now, when you understand modern biology, everything is different than it was before you understood that. You see everything around you, I hope, if it's done right, differently. The theory tries to explain sort of the history of life on the planet and its diversity, which is just this massive topic, and everything you do and everything you see is the result of an evolutionary process. And so I try and, you know, convey that notion to them, in part through explaining who Darwin was and how he came up with his ideas. And
actually, do you think that also time, in some sense, helped? Because he was also, right, during that time when in France there was Marck, right? In Germany, right, a bit different time, but still very close. There was a Humboldt. So the time was also very rich. So could you maybe comment on that a little bit? Because
sure, right. I mean, so Darwin's ideas came out. You know, the most famous ideas on the origin of species came out in 1859. But you know, he was writing about this and talking about this from the late 1840s, and this was you know, a very rich intellectual time, both in the United Kingdom, where you have, you know, fundamental discoveries being made in natural history and chemistry and physics and mathematics. And then you have similar things going on around Europe, and you have similar things going on around the world. I mean, it's a little post-Enlightenment times, but it's still that flavor of an early time where people are just beginning to sort of piece together the big ideas. And Darwin's was in many ways one of the biggest. I mean, I you know, arguably I would say the only idea that's sort of bigger in its scope would be understanding the history of the universe. But people were trying to do that. But you know, that's the level at which people were thinking at that time, I think. And it was in many ways, well, it was a little bit of an easier time to handle those kinds of issues, because the amount of information was not nearly as overwhelming as it is now. You know, there were not a lot of people doing this. There was not a lot of studies and published information on any of these things, from evolution to chemistry to physics to whatever. And so it was a little bit easier to try and wrap your head around big questions. I mean, we still do that today. It's just we have to do that in not only the way they did, but also with, you know, 10,000 papers a year coming out on the topic.
Exactly.
So the challenges are different.
Yeah, but actually coming back, that's interesting what to say, because that comes back to also the question which I wanted to discuss with you as a researcher, more than also the lecturer and author of many books on these topics, because evolution of the field, evolutionary biology, right, evolves. So, and could you maybe phrase some of the challenges? Because I know that in your group, you are working a lot also on the behavioral, right, biology, but could you frame maybe some challenges so that our listeners could also understand what you're working on, what is difficult?
In evolutionary biology in general.
Or now, because I mean, from Darwin, right, we understand what were challenges at that time to formulate it as a tree, and maybe now there are also some things which are quite hard to prove, right, or to model or to understand, and maybe there are any examples of this kind of open problems from your group or from anywhere.
Well, I mean, so, at Darwin, if we start back in Darwin's time, let's say in the late 1850s, there were no studies per se on the sort of things Darwin was discussing. There was a lot of information, a lot of natural history, but no studies really. And so there were all sorts of problems that Darwin faced because he had to think very hypothetically and very theoretically. And so, he couldn't turn to tell people, here are 25 studies on the evolution of behavior and 25 studies on the evolution of fur color and whatever. So he had to think very generally and very theoretically and very conceptually. Also, a lot of Darwin's arguments were based on the fossil record. And the fossil record is a tough thing to study, and it was especially tough. We know more about it now than we did then, but even then it was very, very difficult. It's very sparse. I mean, it's sort of, people talk about, well, finding things floating around in an infinite space out in the universe is hard. Well, it's kind of like that when you work down from the planet's surface. I mean, there's just so much area and so many places that fossils could be, that even if we're really good at finding them, it's just hard. And a lot of them aren't there anymore. They've decomposed for a million different reasons. So the fossil record is scarce. It's still scarce. It's not as scarce as it was, but it's still scarce. People at that time, at Darwin's time, Mendel's ideas on genetics, nobody knew. I mean, basically Mendel's, he had come up with them right around the time Darwin published, but nobody knew about it. And it wasn't until 1900 that people did. And so there was really no genetics for Darwin to turn to. So he had to sort of come up with how this might work with what today we call genetics, even though there was no real field of that.
Exactly.
Same thing with one area in evolution that's, that a lot of people are working on now is sort of evolution of development. So that is, all organisms go through stages of development that can be extraordinarily different from one another, right? So if you think about even human development, what happens in the uterus is very different than what happens during the first few years, which is very different in terms of the structures your body needs and the way it works. And so people are interested in the evolutionary paths that led to understanding how organisms develop from a single cell to, a billion or multiple billion cell, multiple trillion cell organisms. At Darwin's time, again, there was very little known. Some Ernst Haeckel, and there were other people who were studying this, but today much more is known. And so virtually every aspect of what he did was challenging at that time. And I'm not even going to get into the challenge that he faced in the sense that there were a lot of people who were not particularly pleased with a natural view of all of this rather than a supernatural view. So essentially, there were a lot of people that were upset that Darwin was basically saying, you know what, we can explain all of this without any reference to supernatural deities. And that's a separate kind of argument. Now, today, we face, evolutionary biology is a thriving field with many, many different parts, but we still face, lots and lots of challenges, and some of the challenges are new. I think the more interesting ones are not necessarily, some of the things we're looking at in my lab are interesting, and I can come back to that, but, one of the major challenges that we're facing right now is the fact that, we have all this molecular genetic knowledge now that we didn't have before. Everything from, basic genome sequencing to CRISPR.
Yeah.
Right. The thing is that this provides us with, endless bits of information. The question for an evolutionary biologist is to try and figure out how to work your way through that information to try and understand the evolution of things, right? So if we can identify 5,000 genes that are associated with the development of a honeybee from one cell to the time that it pops out of an egg, that's great. We need to be able to say, okay, we need to be able to do data mining and figure out, okay, how do these genes work? What do they do? How do they interact with each other? When you have 5,000 genes that are affecting something, that can be really hard to do.
Exactly.
And that's why, you know, we turn to a lot of your colleagues, mathematicians, who are trying to work with, develop algorithms where we can, you know, automate this process and understand functionality that way.
Yes, it's beautiful, because that brings actually to the one of the final questions which I wanted to ask, because the evolution, right? Evolution of nature, but also evolution as a field of science, or evolution of the whole science. How do you present it to yourself? Do you feel that it's a tree, or does it have actually many branches? Because what you're saying, right, that we kind of merge together, right? More and more informatics, mathematics, biology, and everything. How do you present it for yourself, visually, or not necessarily visually?
Well, you know, it can be challenging. So I have an evolution textbook that my colleague Carl Bergstrom and I wrote, exactly. And you know, we have to deal with this issue, and you know, it's very, very difficult to do in terms of like just taking it all in. And so I personally try to do it in two ways. One is to compartmentalize a little bit. And so, you know, there are times when I'll be thinking strictly about the evolution of behavior, which is my own area of expertise. And there'll be other times, you know, where I'm writing for the textbook, and I'm going to write the chapter on evolution and development. And so I will go into that literature and I will try and figure out how to present that. There are other times when I just attempt to synthesize it all in my head, and that is not an easy thing. So if someone said, well, you know, write me one page about all the interesting things going on in evolutionary biology, that would be much more challenging than writing 600 pages on it.
Yeah.
But you know, one thing that I tell my students, and I tell you know, when I give lectures to the general public, is I think, you know, maybe the most interesting piece of advice or that I got when I was doing my PhD. So I did my PhD with this wonderful scientist by the name of David Sloan Wilson. By the way, you guys should reach out to David for lecturers.
Sure.
He is amazing. He is amazing. His name is David Sloan Wilson. Anyway, David told me when I was just starting my PhD, you know, there's nothing that you can't study from an evolutionary perspective. And that includes culture. So a lot of my work is actually on the evolution of culture. Now, we don't have time to talk about that work right now, but the point was that was both an incredible eye-opening experience and also a little bit sort of terrifying for a grad student, right? Because at one level, it means you can really study anything you want from an evolutionary perspective. At another level, if you're kind of thinking, okay, if I'm going to do this, that means I have to understand a little bit about a lot of things, because you know, if we can understand everything from an evolutionary perspective, and I want to be an evolutionary biologist, I need to at least understand a little bit about every branch that can be of science that can be affected by an evolutionary thinking. And I would argue that is every branch of science. And so it's challenging, but it's what makes it all enjoyable. Of course.
I hope that people also can find some answers also reading your books, and we will be happy to discuss with you more. So you're always welcome for lectures without borders, and we will be very happy to meet with you again.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you too.